Yeah, and we also know that the student visa, particularly thanks to the Boris wave since 2021, has been a source of our net migration ails, not just because they had former student dependents, which is hilarious. I mean, one, why would you come to university and bring your mum? But also, most students aren't working a full time job to be able to support them. So, very mysterious. But also, the Deliveroo visas. They come over, they sign up for a 1 year's master's course, they drop out midway through, and they become a cyclist. I think that wasn't as much
But
of an
just
issue.
briefly on that, Colin,
Yeah.
it's just briefly on that, if I may, because it's a critical point, and just to give you a very brief. The university class are obsessed with telling you international students are just a win-win. They refuse to accept what the evidence shows, and I know you know this evidence because you've written about it, that what happens is we gave 1.7 million visas to international students between 21 and 2024. We know that many of those students came in for 1 year MA programs, not at Oxford and Cambridge, but they went to non-elite universities. They then transfer over onto other visa programs. They get jobs as Just Eat delivery drivers. They keep going until they can get indefinite leave to remain, and then they're here forever. We know that it's a massive Ponzi scheme. The only people who refuse to accept that are the vice chancellors in the university class, because guess what? It's a sacred value that you can't question. But it's absolutely absurd. I mean, I don't want to make this personal about any universities, but I can tell you this as a professor. I was told not to fail international students because we needed their money. Okay. So when you talk to me about meritocracy, you talk to me about having the best of the best and maintaining rigorous academic standards and prioritizing individual achievement. What I'm saying to you is, in this Ponzi scheme, what matters more than anything to universities is the money. It's not academic excellence. And that is how, again, the system is being systematically downgraded.
Yeah, that international partnership scheme pre Boris Wave, pre Brexit being finalised was certainly a cause for censorship at Kent, because I remember the student union had invited the Bollocks to Brexit bus onto campus. I think this is 2018 or 2019. And one student was investigated, I tell you not, by the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Department because he was in the background of a photo they took with that blonde woman who used to play the guitar outside Parliament. And he did the OK hand symbol. And they cited the 4chan hoax that said it meant white power to him and tried to hold his degree to ransom. Obviously, because the University of Kent said they were a European university and were benefiting from the subsidies provided to them by the government to keep the Erasmus scheme flowing. So they didn't want to cut Brexit off. Very curious. The other thing that
But
happened.
it's
Sorry.
interesting, we were there at the same time, right? And so you will remember the other scandal, which was that students were told they can't dress up as cowboys because it was triggering
On
to the
Wednesday.
sensibilities of other students. And also, they couldn't dress up as a working class chav because that was also considered to be enormously triggering. Um, but I don't want to personalize this because there are lots of good people at Kent, and I still have friends there. But many of those universities are really giving the country a masterclass in how not to run universities outside of the Russell Group. The reality is we have too many universities. Many of them should be merged with local community colleges and vocational colleges, and we should be using them to focus on adult skills and to focus on leveling up left behind areas in those regions, not kind of trying to position them as competitors to Russell Group institutions, which basically isn't, it's never going to be viable. So the moment you took the student cap off, Oxford, Manchester, Nottingham, they're hoovering up undergraduates. So there's nothing really left for many universities, and alongside that, we've got, the issues that are undermining genuine academic experiences for students, like decolonization, anti-racism training, which of course was made mandatory at Kent for a while at least. And I taught a third year module. And what was so fascinating to me is by the time undergraduates got to my module in the third year, there would always be a group every year who would say, I'm really pleased to be taking this module because I feel as though in my first 2 years at university, I've been indoctrinated. I feel as though I've only been given a particular view. Now, look, this is not just about praising my particular module. It was a great module, always got very high student evaluations, but I found that very depressing that and you know this because you're closer to that world than I am, and you're a lot younger than me. Students always said to me in the third year, look, I know how to game this system. I know that I can focus on a few weeks. I can do my essay on 1 week. I can focus on a few other weeks to get me through the exam. I know what my lecturers and professors are looking for. I can get a sense of where their politics are, what their ideological outlook is. So even if I don't believe it, I know that if I write on, the colonized, oppressed peoples of, wherever, chances are I'm going to probably get a good grade. And they, to their credit, students were just being pragmatic. I want a 2-1 or I want a first class degree. Here's what I've got to do to get it. I, as an academic, found that so depressing because we shouldn't be here to encourage groupthink, and we shouldn't be here to be just, talking about diversity, but actually preaching conformity, because that's what it is. It's just conform to the liberal progressive worldview. And students always said that to me, and I felt, wow, what a waste of higher education. What a waste of an amazing experience that also, by the way, you paid 50, 60 grand for. And we have just killed that intellectual climate for students, and we've really hollowed it out. And I don't think that's what universities should be doing at all.
No, I had my own grades held hostage by political correctness. I had one master's essay where I was critiquing Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, one of the longest tomes of tripe I've ever read, marked pseudonymously and late by an academic who said, I've chosen to use a pseudonym because this essay threatens ideas that I've based my very career on. And then my master's thesis, the Free Speech Union tried to intervene but couldn't do much because the head of department, who is a Palestinian liberation activist and a Marxist who taught a Marxist module, said no thanks. But we intervened because my master's module was given a first by one marker and the only 2-2 I've ever got by another marker, because he said that I was wrong to say the Soviet Union ran concentration camps. So that was the kind of ideological groupthink that's set in the English department. And I blame the English department specifically because this will come on to a question. Kent, well, the time I was there from 2017 to 2021 was the epicenter of the university union strikes when loads of lecturers and associate lecturers went on strike. It predominantly came from the Kent English department, spread around the country. And this led to a mass culling of some up-and-coming, working as lecturers to put themselves through the PhD, assistant lecturers. And now it seems like the funds are so bad that, of course, they've laid off academics like yourself, given them severance pay because they can't afford to meet the bills. Is this sort of ideologically motivated repeat rounds of strikes, which students have never been compensated for, still going on? Is there any chance of this stopping?
So when I left, the strikes were beginning to wind down, but there was a lot of industrial action that followed the COVID pandemic that I did not participate in, and I did not think was fair to students who had gone through successive lockdowns, which also I didn't agree with, had then had their education fundamentally upended by things like, stay-at-home exams, open book exams, which again, I just thought was a bit of a joke. We were then pushing as much material online as possible, which, to be honest, academics like, because it means they don't have to go to campus and they don't really have to work as hard. And I just watched the intellectual climate and the campus environment collapse. And then we had endless rounds of industrial disputes, which I just thought was so self-indulgent on the part of academics and vice chancellors. And again, I was just standing in sort of these empty lecture rooms, just thinking, what are we doing to students? And more fundamentally, what am I doing with my life? And I mean, the reality, I think, is even if my university hadn't run into financial problems, I was basically going to leave anyway. And the reaction among colleagues to me leaving was also very revealing because, you've got to understand that most academics, aside from being super left-wing, they're very frustrated people because deep down, they know they could have done some really interesting things in their life, maybe, but they've ended up in this position where, life maybe isn't going so great, and they've watched many of their peers move on and do more interesting things with their life, and they sort of, they feel really bitter about things like Brexit and long period of conservative dominance, and most further left of Keir Starmer, so they won't be particularly supportive of his government, and it just struck me as a very depressing place to spend the rest of my life. And then when I left, it was kind of fascinating to me to see how they would write up that departure. And what you saw was a kind of like a strange alliance between super left-wing journalists and super left-wing academics that went through all of my whatever they could edit online would now sort of describe me as this former academic, as if I was sort of no longer capable of producing research and papers. And the Financial Times does this thing whereby if you're ever quoted in the FT as an academic, it's very interesting because they'll say, well, this is a conservative academic, Thomas Jones or whatever. Whereas, they would never say, socialist academic, Marxist academic, So in this way, what you realize is, essentially the gatekeepers are trying to control and define the parameters of knowledge. And they really have a very exaggerated sense of self-importance, most academics. They really do genuinely think they are gatekeepers to the culture. Whereas in reality, 85% of academic articles are never read. And so I'll give you an example. My Substack reaches 1.5 million people. We have 1.5 million views every month. I know you can have a much bigger impact in the wider culture, in the wider national conversation than you'll ever have as an academic. And there's a lot of bitterness, there's a lot of jealousy. I think was it Kissinger who said, the reason academics fight so hard is because the stakes are so low. And that is sort of what runs between it. And the most successful academics I know, the ones who really had an impact on policy, governments, and the culture, are academics who have left the universities. I mean, I think about, I did Jordan Peterson's podcast a few days ago, and we were having we were sort of both reminiscing on our lives in the universities and sort of saying how much greater impact you can have off campus, leaving those institutions behind. Neil Ferguson, again, somebody I really respect. I know, you've worked closely with his wife, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and again, another example, in terms of the impact she's had outside of the legacy universities, may give speeches and talks and so on at Oxford and Cambridge, but fundamentally, these are people who have helped change the zeitgeist by being free of the stifling groupthink in the university class. And I made the decision to leave before the 7th of October. But again, when I saw the aftermath of that playing out in the universities, when you saw the heads of the Ivy League colleges giving testimony at the US Congress being unable to condemn anti-Semitism on campus, and you saw, not just one or two, but many university professors across the West voicing their support for Hamas resistance, I was just, at that point, I was done. But when I saw that, I just found it deeply offensive and just gross. I just didn't want to be around those people anymore. And so that's not to say giving up on the universities, because what we also have, Connor, I think two things give me reason for optimism, and Lotus Eaters partly fits into this story. The first is we now have a generation of academics who understand the importance of building parallel institutions. The University of Austin, the Peterson Academy, the Centre for Heterodox Social Science at Buckingham, among others, they are symbolic of a new generation of parallel institutions that are going to train and cultivate and produce a new generation of students who have had what we might call a classical higher education, right? Who have really done the greatest hits, Western civilization and so on, as well as, Buckingham, for example, the first ever course in understanding, analyzing and explaining woke ideology, but also is basically the first course of its kind that is openly skeptical of that ideology. You'll never get that in legacy institutions. But secondly, the rise of an ecosystem that surrounds that, which is the rise of podcasts, Substacks, YouTube channels, and others that are fully independent from and insulated from the legacy universities, who have an audience of their own, have a following, and are contributing to what Jonathan Haidt might call viewpoint diversity. I don't really like that term because I don't think diversity should be the kind of overriding goal here. Free speech is what we should call it, right? Protecting and promoting free speech and free expression. And that ecosystem, I think, yourself is an example. I can think of others, former students of mine now work with me in my office and so on. A generation of students who have come through the institutions, but who are now playing an active role in cultivating this new ecosystem. Because as we've seen since Trump's re-election, the counterculture is the culture now. It's just that the elite class hasn't realized that. The counterculture is the culture. Or as somebody said to me when I was over for the inauguration, when you see a group of young girls in a private members club in New York City wearing MAGA hats, you realize the culture's changed and the culture has shifted. So this ecosystem will only get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger as legacy institutions eventually at some point will be forced to realize that, oh, actually, we're going to have to try and do business with this counterculture. And what does that look like? Well, that looks like having prominent Trumpian columnists in major national newspapers. It means having BBC documentaries on the rape gangs. It means, Channel 4 not becoming a kind of woke madrasa, but actually doing, proper news and journalism. And this is what I think we're going to go in. This is what I think we're going to see over the next 10, 20 years, because these are not viable business models, legacy institutions anymore, as you can see with the universities.
Thank you for watching that clip from Tomlinson Talks. If you liked that and you would like to see more, you can get the full 90-minute show every week on a Wednesday afternoon, live from 3 p.m., only on lotuseaters.com, and all of the other content that my colleagues produce behind the paywall for as little as £5 a month. Thank you very much for supporting us, and I hope to see you there. Until next time, goodbye.